Welcome back, everyone, to the Personal Finance Week. And today we're joined by Steve. He's a Xoogler. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He was head of GPay and BDPSB partnerships, and now he's an advisor on multiple boards. So welcome, Steve, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So I left Google about 2 or so years ago, 2.5 years ago, and I was at Google for 9 years. Worked at 10 different companies over 44-year career. And second half of my career mostly worked on partnerships. The first half of my career was mostly sales and sales management. Um, and uh, I had the good fortune of participating in 3.5 IPOs. I can explain that later. And then one exit. And that provided a lot of opportunity to, have responsibility around fiscal things and choices with regard to fiscal decisions. So I was very fortunate in that regard. So I live in San Mateo, been here in the same house for 35 years. Originally from New York City, grew up in New Jersey, went to school in Boston, graduated from college and moved to California immediately, like 60 days later. And I've been here, ever since. Um, so I was going to give a little bit of context and a few thoughts. There were a few questions that dribbled in from folks that I can try to address as we start talking. And then really, I just wanted to open it up and, field any questions that people might have. Um, One of the points that I guess I would make is context is king. So for me personally, I'm the child of two immigrant Holocaust survivor parents, which definitely had a huge impact on my life and how I choose to operate with regard to financial decisions and the like. My parents. My father had three separate jobs at any given time. He had a high school equivalency exam from the Army because his childhood education was disrupted by having to move out of Germany and move to New York. Um, my mom was a homemaker and then worked in retail and then got a real estate license and became a very successful realtor for 25 plus years, which actually she became the primary breadwinner, in the family. So that was another interesting experience given the time that was happening in. Um, so I also had an uncle who was an ROTC grad and a Harvard MBA grad, who was the CEO of a public company. And he gifted me my first shares in a public company when I was 13 years old, of course, for my bar mitzvah. Um, and that got me interested in the stock market at a very, very young age. Um, just celebrated my 40-year wedding anniversary, and have two grown children, 32 and 34 years old. And the good news is they're healthy, they're happy, and they've abandoned us. One lives in St. Louis and one lives in Atlanta. My daughter is married 7 years already, and her husband's a doctor in St. Louis. My son works for MongoDB, which many of you are probably familiar with, out of Atlanta. Anyway, the thing we were going to talk about today was things around fiscal spending choices and how it impacts, on career choices that you can make. And, throughout my career, but especially the second half, a lot of younger colleagues would look at my trajectory and come to me and, ask for advice, which I enjoyed, those sessions over the years. And for myself personally, and then ultimately as a piece of advice, I would often advise that, I strongly believe it makes sense to conserve your money, especially early in your career. And maybe you can avoid the $700 a month lease on the BMW and buy a Toyota Corolla instead. It's that mentality, not that specific act, but that mentality that can lead to a situation where you can be in a stronger position when it comes to making career choices. And the expression I came up with was FU money. If you have FU money, you can oftentimes, maybe take your time a little bit more when you're looking for that next job, or when you're in a job. You can maybe be a little bolder with your, how you go about performing, because you're maybe willing to take some additional chances, be a little bit more of a risk taker. And as I went through my career journey, and other than Google, which was a complete anomaly for me, prior to Google, I had worked for all early stage companies. And again, got very lucky, 2.5 or 3.5 IPOs and one exit. But oftentimes, and my wife had retired after the first IPO, so my income was the sole source of operating capital for the family. Um, you know, my wife, often, she had worked at Bank of America and Wells Fargo and Visa, so she was used to working at big established companies, and I went to these startup companies, and I could tell you all some stories that would make your hair go on fire about even companies like Verifone that almost went bankrupt 3 times while I was there, or CyberSource that we almost decided to shut down, and the like. So all along those journeys, the fact that I had been a little bit more conservative with my spending and had, a backup, had some money in reserve, was the luxury that I had that gave me the freedom to make some of the choices that I made, along the way. So I'll just pause there for a quick second. And one of the questions I got was, what were your IPO experiences like, and how did they change your financial expectations, if at all? And I can come back to that, but why don't I pause there, since we have a group, and I know that there's going to be some people dropping off at the half-hour mark. So why don't I pause there and see if there's any questions that people are dying to ask.
Steve, I can kick it off. This is Gary. So curious about, I know you and I have had some discussions in the past about cash flow and investments that produce cash flow. You don't have to answer it right now, but within your talk, if you can kind of talk through some ideas or some ways for folks to kind of think about that and how to prepare yourself to have cash flowing investments.
Yeah, so again, as a result of having participated in these various IPOs and the like, diversification is probably, I'm not some genius who came up with the idea of diversification. I think it's a pretty standard term that everybody talks about. So we diversified early on and bought some investment property, which, this goes back 15 to 25 years. And we now own them outright, and they are positive cash flow, investments. And then from a, equities standpoint, I would say that, half of the stocks that I own are dividend, paying stocks. And I very much, I have some, money in stocks that are pure speculation and and tech, which often doesn't pay a dividend. Shame on Google for not paying a dividend, by the way. There's no excuse at this point for where Google has come to and the amount of cash they have sitting around that they're not paying a dividend. But definitely take that into strong consideration. So I have a very, I manage all my own stock activity. Don't use any sort of advisors. I do have a small portion of my money in a robo service at Schwab. But most of the rest of it I manage myself, and I'd say half is in ETFs and the other half is in individual stocks, mostly large blue chip stocks, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Meta, etc. And so the washing all of that out, I'm at a point now, of course, my wife's on Social Security. I will be on Social Security in 18 months. Nothing to laugh about. It's, I earned it, I guess, so I'm going to take it. But, all of those things together put me in a position now where I don't have to worry about, overhead. Obviously, we own our primary residence. I was very, as much as I possibly could, pay off mortgages, as fast as possible. So again, between the real estate, the dividend paying stocks, and the like, that combination is very important. I guess one interesting comment that I would make is when I was managing, my parents are both passed, as is my wife's. We lost all four of our parents within about an 18-month period 5 years ago. I was managing my mother was the last to pass, and I was managing all of her stocks as well. And once she passed, and I was talking to her accountant and the like, and he was looking at the portfolio, and he was saying, like, did you realize how old your mother was? Like, why weren't all of the investments in, like, bonds, right? And I said, well, the fact of the matter is that my mother didn't need to worry about, her current expenses. So I was investing her money as if it was for her children and her grandchildren, with more of a growth outlook than a capital preservation, outlook. He thought I was nuts, but that was just the nature of the philosophy, that I had. So again, any other questions?
If you
Okay.
have a question, I have a question. So,
Sure.
this is about debt and the concept of good debt and bad debt and how to assess
Sure.
what is good debt for personal finance. So let's say, like real estate, we take out a loan. It is technically a good debt, and if you can rent it out and make back more than your own interest, it is a positive cash flow. So should you rush to pay off that loan in order to have a higher ROI, or is it better to continue to invest in more and more real estate properties and accrue that good debt, even though it may seem a bit scary?
Yeah, well, things can definitely seem scary. I guess, I come back to my context is king, point before. Those of us who live here in California have, even through bad times, you can generally count on the real estate market, continuing to go up. And it really depends on your overall financial picture,
Right.
and how much risk you're comfortable taking. What age and stage are you in your life?
Mm.
I often tell people that I worked at CyberSource for 9 years, and I worked at a company called Verifone for 9 years. And probably in hindsight, I would have left both companies closer to the 7-year mark. But in both cases, I had children that, were at a certain age and stage at each of those moments. And it just, you know, it was easier to stay with what I knew and the company that, you know, I was confident wasn't going anywhere. You know, but you know, frankly, I wasn't as enthralled with working at those companies after the 7-year mark in either case. But I just stayed for an extra couple of years. And who knows, you know, you never know, would that have been, you know, if I had left and gone someplace else, maybe I would have joined Google 5 years earlier. I don't know, you know, which probably in hindsight would have been a good thing. So I would say that, you know, of course, like we inspired our kids to both get credit cards, you know, as soon as they left the house and went to college, but we, you know, were pounding on their heads like you never revolve. Or maybe you do it just a little bit just to build your credit, but you know, like, you know, you're going to pay it right off. As far as the mortgage thing is concerned, yeah, there's a lot of debate as to whether, if you have a decent mortgage, I mean, my first mortgage was 12.5% interest. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven because mortgage rates were at 18% just before I did that transaction. This was back in the early 80s, 1980s. And of course, now a lot of us are spoiled. We think we should get 3 and 4% mortgages. So, I mean, if you have a 3 or 4% mortgage, and you're reasonably confident in your career situation, you know, I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, I would do a little bit of both. I would, you know, put an extra couple of $100 a month towards the mortgage. But as opposed to throwing $1,000 extra every month at the mortgage. But then I also, again, this is all very personal. I also wouldn't necessarily quickly go out and buy yet another piece of property and leverage myself, you know, that much more. So, and of course, in hindsight, I wish every time I had done a personal real estate transaction, I had kept, you know, the property instead of selling it when I was like moving from my personal residence 1 to personal residence 2. That's easy to say and not so easy to do. Right. You know, I've had situations where, like, the first house my wife and I bought together here in San Mateo, we went to sell it 5 years later when our daughter was born. We had a sale. It was ready to close. We had already committed to buying the house that we're in now. And then the sale on the other place fell through, you know, and, you know, we had to scramble to find another buyer because you know, we were counting on that money to buy this house, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, the moment we closed, this was in 1989 on this house, the market crashed like a month later. And, you know, we were underwater in this house for the first 3 years. And then it finally started, you know, the market started coming back, you know, et cetera. So again, these are, you know, I don't think there are any 100% pure gospels. A lot of it is, you know, your you know, personal risk tolerance, and you know, if you have other backstops that you can call upon if something really went haywire. Right. You know, and you know, not everyone has the luxury of that. And so anyway, I'll pause again and see if anyone else has any other questions.
Guys, if you're not able to speak, please do leave your questions in the chat. I can read them out for you.
And while we're waiting for that, so one of the questions was, you know, what were your IPO experiences like, and how did they change your financial expectations, if at all? Yeah, that was, you know, very, very intriguing. The very first IPO that I was involved in was a company called Verifone, which I think everyone pretty much is familiar with the company. I was the 35th employee. I was there for 9 years. This was back in the mid 80s. That's the 1980s. And most of you weren't born. And the company, like, the founder had left. We had a new CEO. He forced us to be profitable for like 8 straight quarters before we went, public, which, in many cases is heresy, or has become heresy. And we had a very successful, IPO, and there's no question that it's a transformational event, and you then though have to realize that like life goes on. It's like your wedding day. Like, the hard work begins after your wedding is over and the partying is over. Same thing for working for a company that has just gone public. Being a public company takes on a whole new thing, especially if you're on the management team. So again, it was wonderful. And I can't begin to contemplate if I had had perfect, hindsight about what moves I would have made, how much stock I would have kept versus sold, et cetera. But I got enough off that, it provided a nice little, cushion and the foundation for, matter of fact, one of the remodels that we've done to this house, we call it the Melton Wing, which was the next IPO that I participated in, which was a company called Cyber Cash, which doesn't exist any longer. We were the very first internet payment gateway, and I was the third employee there. We went public with 0 revenue. So talk about like how things had changed. This was during the .com bubble days. And that company ultimately went bankrupt, luckily a few years after I left. So I, again, got enough off the table to make it worthwhile, but could have made an awful lot more money if I had, sold more, when I first had the opportunity to do that. Then I went to a company called CyberSource, which, very interesting story. We also went public with very modest revenue. We were definitely, losing money as a company. And we went out at $11 a share. We promptly went up to $81 a share. Again, this is a company with virtually, immeasurable, unmeasurable revenue. And 6 months later, we did a secondary for about $58 a share. I forget exactly what the number was. And just ignore that. Then about 6 months after that, the .com bubble burst. And we went down to like $1.87. Definitely in hindsight, wish I had, I got enough off the table that it was positive. It was a great, it was great, but could have made a lot more money if I had been more aggressive in selling. One of the things about being on the management team of a company that goes public, and this is less so true today because we had pure options back in the day. Now everyone's got GSUs, which is a very different economic situation. But with pure options, you're kind of pressured to, not sell aggressively if you're a part of the management team because it doesn't look good for the company. Even though I was a senior member of the management team and an early employee, like still the original, the actual founders had much more, stock at their disposal. And at my level, I probably should have sold much more aggressively, than I did. And matter of fact, CyberSource spun out of a company originally called Software.net that got renamed Beyond.com. That ended up going bankrupt, and we all got shares in both companies. And I remember vividly when Beyond.com went public, I thought their business model was a bunch of hooey. And I really wanted to just sell everything I could sell, but it was made very clear to us that, that would not bode well for, you continuing to be on the management team. And so, I sold a little bit, maybe 15, 20% of what I had, and hung on to the rest, which ended up being toilet paper. So, but again, I also know people during the dot-com bubble days who, even with just paper gains, they went and committed to buying houses, and before the paper gains turned into real gains, and then they ended up like totally sideways. And that all ties to some of these decisions that you need to be conscious of about, how you spend your money. I mean, anybody who's not like doubling and tripling down on their 401ks, with their companies, is making a big mistake. I have every 401k, that I've had the opportunity to participate in. I've maxed, my contribution level. And, I know it seems like a lot of money, but, you won't miss it once you fill out the form and get it in motion. You'll function on the money you have left, and that's absolutely the best way over the long term to build that comfort zone that you're definitely going to want to have throughout your career. I can tell you that there were many times that I made some bolder career decisions about changing jobs, or even within the company I was working with, because I had that cushion, and I didn't have to worry that, like, if I got fired or whatever, like I was going to be out panhandling. And so I think it's an important component. And let's see, where do you think you were lucky and unlucky? Well, clearly I can say very matter-of-factly, the luck of having been involved in 3.5 IPOs and one exit. There was absolutely luck that participated in that, and I have no dreams of or illusions that was not the case. In every case, we worked our ass off, but we absolutely got lucky, or I got lucky, along that journey. But people say you make your own luck, and within some degree, that's true. But it definitely is. If you're not self-confident enough to realize that it's not all about you, and that some of what happens is tied to getting lucky, you need to look in the mirror. is all I would say. Couple of other things. This is some of my own personal philosophical things about how I spend my money. Don't ever buy extended warranties, and don't buy whole life insurance. Now, I don't know if Chris is on the phone, but I don't know if Chris is here, but it was funny just the other day, one of the former Google VPs, his company was pitching buying whole life insurance. And I went to Bard and I asked the question, should you buy term life insurance or whole life insurance as an investment? And the answer clearly came back from Bard. So this is not me, although it's part of my belief system as well, that you should not buy whole life insurance and think of it as an investment. I actually owned a whole life insurance policy at some point, and it's kind of like buying a boat. Like, I was super excited. I thought I was making a good decision the day that I signed up for the whole life insurance policy. But I was also very happy 15 years later, when I was still paying like $600 a month into this stupid policy, that I quit and cashed out of it. Same thing, the old adage about the happiest day, the happiest 2 days of your life is the day you buy your boat and then the day you sell your boat. Unfortunately, often for less than you bought it for. And that's one of those things. Also, again, a lot of personal decisions. My wife and I have often bantered about buying, vacation home. And personally, my philosophy is I want to go where I want to go, when I want to go. I'll pay what it costs to go. Um, Anybody I've ever known who has owned a vacation home ends up dreading it, from my experience. The pipes freeze when you're not there, or the bear breaks into the kitchen and destroys the house if it's up in Tahoe. Happens all the time. Lots of my friends have had that happen. Or people who buy timeshares and then ultimately realize they're paying, thousands of dollars a month in maintenance fees. So we prefer to just, when we want to go on vacation, we just go on vacation and go to wherever we want to go. And we don't feel obligated, to go back to the place that we own, just for the hell of it. So keep your life simple, I guess, is the bottom line advice. And also accumulating things. As you get older, you come to realize, that your kids are not going to want all the crap that you accumulate. I mean, when I walk my dog and I walk by people's houses and they have their garage door open and there's no room in anybody's garage except mine for their cars, because they're just stuffed with crap that they don't need anymore or don't want. So, really, like, pause every time you're about to buy something and think about whether or not it's something you genuinely need and want. A quick, I have a marketing degree. I know a lot of you probably have technical degrees, but one of the early things that stuck in my brain was, once you realize why the milk is always at the back of the supermarket, you start to realize that, I'm a capitalist to the core, but I also know that I'm being marketed to every single day. And you have to be willing and able to sort of pause and not get sucked into every marketing pitch that comes your way. And again, I'm sure that everyone on this call understands why the milk is in the back of the grocery store, right? Because they want you to walk by and buy all the other crap in between, when all you really wanted to do was buy a quart of milk. Anyway, again, I'll pause and see if I see there's something in the chat, but I haven't looked at it.
Oh, it's just Chris saying that he's listening in.
Oh, okay. Got it. Okay.
I thought
Can you share more about life insurance, though, Steve? Why didn't you like it? Why do people keep buying it?
I don't know who was asking that question, but that's
Chris
okay. Yeah, so you absolutely need to have life insurance, and I had term life insurance after I got rid of the whole life policies. And I can share with you, maybe I don't know if I'll have time right now, but go to Bard or go to ChatGPT and ask the question, should you buy whole life insurance as an investment? And the answer is very clear that whole life insurance benefits the company selling the whole life insurance, more so than the buyer of the whole life insurance. Term life insurance is much cheaper, and you take whatever money you saved from not buying whole life insurance and you put it into investments that you can manage separately and have a clear, visibility to what you're investing in. The insurance companies go off and make investments that as much benefit them as you. Every resource that I've ever known has, other than the guy who sold me the whole life insurance 20 years ago, advises against buying whole life insurance. And again, just take the money you would otherwise spend, which is usually 5-7 times what an equivalent term life insurance policy would cost, and go invest that money, separately, and manage those two things, separately. So that's my perspective.
Okay, awesome. Actually, I found that the idea of why the milk in the bag very, very good because I'm a marketer myself. I never really thought of it that way because milk is essential. And that's the only reason you go to the supermarket, but you end up walking past everything and you get marketed too. And usually the marketing pitch nowadays are really good. Just the packaging can be really good. And you end up
Oh
having
yeah.
a $100 basket somehow. Yeah, happens all the time at Costco for me.
Oh yeah. I mean, having studied marketing, even though it kind of contributed to my career journey, but really I got immediately into sales, and it wasn't a bad thing that I learned that I had marketing as an education. But for things like this, it was very valuable to understand how you're being marketed to, and not to be vulnerable to every marketing pitch. A couple of other things I thought I would mention. So somebody asked about so I'm on 2 private company boards now and 4 advisory boards. And I think someone asked how did that come about? But even before I retired, I had been invited to be on half a dozen advisory boards throughout my career. And, you know, a couple of them paid off, which was nice. But normally I agreed to do it because I knew the person who was asking me, and I liked the people, and I believed whatever they were doing was interesting and valuable. But there oftentimes can be an economic payoff. Normally a lot longer term than you think. Matter of fact, in most cases, the ones that did ultimately pay off, I had long since just forgotten about. And then all of a sudden I get an email that says, we want to send you a check. And that's great. It's like a Christmas present, or a Hanukkah present in my case. But anyway, I would strongly suggest that if there's an opportunity to participate in some sort of advisory board capacity, it can be rewarding both personally and professionally. The other thing is angel investing, which is a definite something that is a luxury at this age and stage in my life. So I began angel investing with friends and family 20 or 30 years ago, and most of those actually did not pay off. But great learning experiences. But then about 7 years ago, I joined a group here in the Bay Area called the Band of Angels. And it's a 25-year-old organization. It's one of the original angel investing groups. And I've made 15, 20 investments. And it's a wonderful group, very diverse, nothing to do with my career in payments. But again, you have to realize that, most likely they're not going to pay off. I mean, first of all, if you're lucky, a third of them, will pay off, and the other 2/3 will probably go belly up. So you have to be prepared for that. And then the other thing is, even the ones that are going to pay off, it's probably going to be a 5 to 7 year, time horizon. That's just the nature of investing in angel businesses. But it's an extremely interesting experience. This group, the Band of Angels, which you have to be sponsored to join, it costs several $1,000s to join, and then it costs a few $1,000s a year to continue being a member. Is a wonderful experience. We have a monthly meeting. It's kind of like Shark Tank, to give you a context. We have anywhere from 20 to 50 companies every month that vie for 3 spots to present at the dinner we have each month. And then after the dinner and after the presentations, you decide individually as whether you want to invest or not. But the benefit of being part of an angel group is that the due diligence that gets done is a shared effort, and you get to, there's people who were former CFOs, people who were former, patent attorneys, people like me who more come from the business side and, know how to do sales and marketing and strategic alliances. And you get to just benefit from all of that mixed experience. The idea is that it can reduce the risk, associated, this is not like, your third cousin who comes to you and with some harebrained idea for a business, and you feel compelled to write them a check. It's all very formal, etc. The other thing I would throw out is one of the things that I've participated off and on with over the years is something called expert networks. And this has particularly been interesting for me now that I've retired, but it was also something that I actually participated 15, 20 years ago in. I had become fairly well known in the payments industry as an expert. But whatever your, passion and, segment of choice is, or domain of expertise is, there are companies such as GuidePoint, Alpha Sites, a company called GLG, Gearson Lehman Group, that I get constantly approached to take calls from, like, investment analysts and things. They'll pay you anywhere from $500 to $1,000 an hour, just to jump on a phone call and be, pounded with questions from generally junior analysts who have no clue what they're doing, and are just desperate for knowledge from anybody who's actually, like, a real person in the business world or in the technical world. And anybody who's got on their resume having worked at Google, etc. Again, regardless of what your domain of expertise is, there's a good chance that, you can register for these things. Now, before I joined Google, I was doing some of that in my spare time. Once I joined Google, Google had a bad attitude about people doing those calls, so I didn't do them during my 9 years at Google. But once I left Google and went to Stripe, I started doing them again, because Stripe was a smaller company, didn't have official policy against doing those things. And of course, now that I'm retired, I've done like 40 of those things so far this year. And so they can be, it's not a bad gig. They're kind of fun to do because there's no prep. You can basically make some money, but more importantly, it kind of just keeps you, keeps your mind, active, and gives you the opportunity to think through, what's going on in the minds of the investment community, etc. I see there's another question that's come through.
Yeah, it's coming from Mark. Maybe I can read it out for you. So, in your experience, what's been the typical failure mode for angel investments that don't work out? Do they go out of business cleanly, or do they keep surviving year after year but never able to pay back their investors?
Yeah, that's a good question, because like I said, of the 15 or 20 investments I've made, I don't know if I've said this already on this call, but 3 of them, I think, so far have, gone 4 paws to the sky. And because of the structure that exists within an organization like the Band of Angels, and we use a third party to pool our investments together, so we get a streamlined K1 at the end of the year. And it can be relatively clean. So if a company does fold, it just shows up as a line item on your K1 that the investment has gone sideways. If you're making individual investments, the one thing I did learn early on was, a lot of startup companies don't have their financial operations smoothly operating. And so, like, it caused me to have to delay my tax filings each year, to have to wait for the K1s to show up. So that was a lesson learned in terms of choosing how to invest and what context to invest in. A couple of the investments I have are hanging on, by a thread, but I'm not. It's not costing me anything further per se. I mean, oftentimes, especially in the current climate, many of these companies are coming back now and asking for additional money, and you can choose to double down or just hold tight. But back before I joined the band and when I had done some earlier angel investing, there were definitely some things. And is there any like secret to getting it right and having successful outcomes? My philosophy, similar to my philosophy in the second half of my career about choosing what jobs to take, it was basically like, do the founders have, a proven track record of having had successful exits, previously? Even if they've had a failure or two along the way, like, have they had a successful exit? And are they mature enough to be able to pivot? Because it inevitably, you have to pivot. And every company I was with that ultimately IPO'd or exited, we pivoted multiple times along the way. And a lot of times you have companies where you have like extremely technical founders who are still coding, 3 years in, when they shouldn't be, or they have what's called founder's disease, and they can't let go and bring in like professional management. And so there are some telltale signs, but if you had the ability to understand the makeup. Now, only investing in companies that are founded by people who had previously had a successful exit narrows the pool of companies you might choose to invest in. But if you're, if the money you're investing is near and dear to your heart, and not like a amount of money you've decided you're willing to set aside and there's a good chance you're going to lose, then you might want to be a little bit more conservative on which companies you choose to invest in.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the answer. I think I was very exhaustive. We're almost running out of time here, so maybe I'll
Yep.
ask you the last question. We talked a lot about startups, and I was wondering because it's generally believed that an MNC will give you a more financially stable position or financial security as compared to a startup. Maybe not so true anymore with all these layoffs. Very unfortunate, but in general, someone like Google should give you more financial security than joining a 10-man startup. So I was wondering why you chose to join startups every time. What was the motivating factor? And whether the difference in financial security ever influenced your decision and what that decision-making process was like for you.
So yeah, it's a great question. And I, I definitely, that did influence my decision making on more than one occasion. But I also came to the realization that there is no security anywhere. The only security you have is in building out your own personal, career and confidence, and result producing, abilities. So once I sort of got comfortable with that notion, I was less concerned about, going to work at a place like Google, versus the startups. Like I said, if Google hadn't called me 13 years ago, I would have never thought about going to work at Google. But it's also hard not to return Google's phone call, when they're approaching you. And I was very fortunate. I got brought in at a level 7, which, I didn't even know what a level 7 was, when I joined. But that all worked out, very well. And because I had success previously with startups that had successful outcomes, even my wife was saying, like, why do you want to join Google? Like, what's that going to do for us or for you? And the 9 years I was at Google, the stock went up 6x, and so it ended up actually having, being a very positive outcome. But some of that was a surprise. But the whole idea of working for a smaller company was very comfortable for me. I wanted to be in a position where I could, have a greater impact. And I surely learned, at Google, and again, I'm sure everyone had different experiences, but it became very difficult to get anything done at Google, especially during the second half of my career there. And had much more flexibility and freedom to be much more impactful in the smaller companies. But again, because I was more fiscally conservative and had some lucky outcomes early in my career, that gave me the luxury to continue to make those choices. And it always came down to, for me, did I like the people, and was I intrigued with the product? If I wasn't intrigued with the product and it wasn't going to make me get out of bed, at 7 a.m, even on a Sunday sometimes, because that's what it took, then it just wasn't going to be appealing to me. And but most of the companies that I worked for prior to Google, had turbulent economic times, off and on. And so I would only share about a third of what was going on with my wife, because she would have lost it if I had, shared all of what the trials and tribulations were along some of those journeys. But at the end of the day, luckily, we worked our ass off and got lucky, and these things ended up working out. But I took like a half salary pay cut to go to work for one startup. But the founder had been the CEO of PayPal and Intuit previously, and his co-founder was someone I knew for 15 years. And I thought the product was I was completely enamored with the product. So I just took the leap, and we almost shut that company down 6 weeks after I joined. But we ended up exiting, after 2 years, and got sold the company, and it turned out to be a good exit. But boy, that was like, whew, that was one of the closest calls that I had made. Anyway, I know we're at time, so I'll just pause there. And if anyone ever wants to chat with me, one-on-one, I do have a Calendly link that I'll put in the chat window. And feel free. I love talking to younger former colleagues, and happy to have conversations. I have the luxury of being retired at this point, so as long as you don't interfere with my tennis schedule, happy to chat with anyone anytime.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve, for sharing so openly about your life and background. I really appreciate it. I'm sure all of us took away something. I think for me, it was definitely the idea of thinking whether I was being marketed to or whether I really need something. I think that was very important for me. Yeah. So once again, thank you, and we will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Great. Take care, everybody.